your home?
Yes,
I
my
see the
condo.
nice, yeah, I see the nice dental work and frame around there and everything. Very nice. Your frame's very good. So,
Thanks. Thanks. This is where I taught. I have an office, and I was thinking, geez, I should probably do the iconography of the bookshelves and all that. But the room is dim until like about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Whereas this room gets this, the Eastern exposure. And this is where I taught. So I taught on Zoom for a whole year, my last year of teaching. And then for one more semester, fall of 21, I guess. And then finally back in fall of 22, I taught for the last time in person with a mask. So, but this room, I can almost get Pavlovian about, just because my classes would usually run from 9:45 to 1, so about this time of day, I get
oh,
used.
okay. So you get the sunlight and everything.
Yeah. So that was, and just enough kind of humanizing of the background, right? Because one of
Yes.
yeah, I don't know.
It looks like a real place. It's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
a phony place. Like I'm
We
phoning
have a
all these
phony place.
conversations like this on Facebook and places, social media.
Hmm.
But it's nice to just have this documentation of people that we know or
Right,
don't know. Like I don't know you,
right,
really. I don't know
right,
you at all. I mean,
right.
the only we didn't. So this is how I'm going to start then.
Okay,
So if we take a like, you know,
right.
yeah. I'm Byron Haskins. This is of the continuance of our series of chats between Wesleyan class of 1976, and I'm here with Joanne Lukitsh. And I say your name right?
You did. Thank you very much. Um, thank you. And I want to start this conversation with an acknowledgement that I have probably been in touch with Byron Haskins more in the years since I graduated from Wesleyan than during my years of graduation. I mean, my years attending Wesleyan. And I really appreciate, Byron, all that you've done, whether it's in the sort of mechanics of being the class secretary or just in keeping a cohort. I don't know that I would exactly use community because, we're pretty dispersed across the country and we have a lot of different interests. And a lot of times, as you said, we weren't even the people who hung out together, as undergraduates. But
Right.
it's really wonderful to have a cohort. And I haven't been to, so many reunions, but I do remember vividly from one of them, we were all sitting at one of the lounges in, I don't know, Lawn Avenue. And it was such a pleasure to be with such good people. I mean, I just, at the risk of, interesting, intelligent. I guess I must have been out in the world enough to know that, you have your ideas of what your professional life's going to be. And, some of it is realized and some of it is, oh, this is interesting. These people are not that, they're not that smart. They can be very successful, but there's a certain, I think Wesleyan, at the time, it was just very, very curious, serious,
Yes.
generous, kind of living in the moment a bit too. Not instrumentalizing everything, which is a characteristic of some professions, right? That everything is always
Yeah.
being done, right? And so even in a nominally social situation like a reunion or something. So I think, so I really, so thank you for, in my estimate at least, keeping that cohort alive or in the world, existing. So I think I appreciate that because I think it matters.
And I've enjoyed doing it. Being class secretary for what I don't know, 20 some years,
20 some
and
years.
then encouraging others to like, okay, you can do this too,
That's right. Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
I'm not the only one who can do this. You can do this too, and pull people together and create, like you said, a cohort. I think that's a really good word. And I like the way that you said that good people, because I've gone to every reunion except for one. And that was my experience, just hanging out, being in the moment. I remember one reunion, I didn't even go to all the reunion activities except for the dinner because I just hung out at Jay Hogarth's house because he had kids, small
Right.
kids, and he really couldn't get around. And just a bunch of us just went there and just got food and communed with each other. And it
Yeah.
was like, that's a great reunion.
Yeah.
And other great reunions are the speakers and people catching up with people and
Mhm.
finding out what they've been doing with their lives and that sort of thing. And
Mhm.
this series that I kind of came up with was just because of the pandemic and that we couldn't get to see each other. And so the reunion committee said, what ways can we do this
Hmm.
in a distance manner that could be meaningful? And um, that gave birth to this idea. And I think what we can do with this is continue it in a way in which it becomes a documentation of our class that will be there for quite a while. And our class, not of who we used to be, but who we are right now as we become the elders of the Wesleyan community.
I know.
Uh, and isn't that something to think about that we've now become the elders of the Wesleyan community?
It is. I remember, I don't know if it was the same reunion, but Ted Shaw, we were over at the Memorial Chapel for some occasion. And I mean, one of the things I'm also realizing about memory. I hope I do find, the reliability of memory as both a historian and also as a person, something to think about too. But I have a pretty strong memory of Ted Shaw saying that our class had the same relation to the current undergraduates as our class had to the Pearl Harbor class. So I don't know,
Oh,
I haven't done the math exactly, of when that would have been, but
mm-hmm.
it was like, whoa, right? That was, when we were at Wesleyan, Pearl Harbor was history. It was, 30 years ago, 35 plus, so realizing that we have that relationship to even longer now. Yes, it's very. I mean, remember the parades where the people at the beginning of the parade were these elderly men, right? They were.
Yes.
It was very. So yes, it's very sobering. I think a little bit, but I appreciate this. I mean, again, I was thinking about this a little bit in terms of being an historian. Like, what would I think about 50 years from now if I got this cache of Zoom files, right? Because in terms of what kind of information is the future interested in, right? Or and also too just the reliability of memory, right?
And I'm going to ask you about that because you document your field in art history is pretty unique in that you document things that are real as opposed to created, right?
Yes, yes,
Photography,
definitely.
is a
Right.
capture of a moment, of an actual real moment. And the art, the value of the art of capturing real moments as opposed to creating something like out of the
Yes,
out of whole cloth.
out of the mind, out of
Yeah. Hmm.
observation. I mean, I would, and also you had mentioned about the people who had influenced you. I mean, I would not have become an art historian if it were not for Clark Maines, um, John Paletti, Jay Seeley. Even he was a studio photographer, but he used to bring in such interesting guest speakers. I mean, I in retrospect, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. I mean, they were all kinds. They weren't all just quote famous people. They were people who worked in very high quality gravure, like Meriden gravure, which was the standard
Hmm.
for photogravure publishing of books. And so he had a very expansive understanding of what photo was. His own work was very, very, it was very crafted. It wasn't temporal, right? He defined, he was one of the people. And again, this is part, in retrospect, you see how it fits into a larger frame of people who were challenging the objectivity of photography, challenging,
So
it's
that too, as well as yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
But then, with because I was a history major, and again with like Robert Peter Hall, Ben Tipton. I'm blanking on his first name, but Mayer. I don't think it's Robert Mayer, but a very distinguished Americanist. And again, nobody ever said, that's not interesting. Or, I mean, it was always, let's think about that. Or how are we going to figure this out? It's just, and again, especially with Clark and John, both of whom had very different kind of relationships to the academy. John had gone to Yale. He was very much, Yale, have his fraught relationship with Yale because I went to a different graduate school, University of Chicago. But it's a very, it was really the locus of one of the East Coast school to go for art history. And Clark,
my first wife was a graduate student at Yale for art history.
So what I'm talking about, right?
A little bit.
A little bit, just. So anyway, and Clark had gone. He was older, right? He hadn't just gone. He'd gone to Penn State, because they had this excellent medievalist. And Clark did really important work. I mean, they're both likely still around, but I mean, Clark did really innovative, and both of them did actually. But and yet, and John Pauletti had some kind of. I mean, he made a lot of friends who were artists. Saul Lewitt, excuse me, other people, and but just such smart, curious. I mean, people who knew what they were doing as far as their own scholarship was concerned, but were very capable of guiding and inspiring people in fields that weren't theirs, really. So I mean, I truly would not be an artist. I mean, would not be an art historian, because I used to think, and again, I don't know if this is your experience, but I used to think it was kind of pretentious as a field, that it was a lot of it was very required. We had to have these languages, and you had to go to Europe, and I mean, and that was a very limited perspective, but I mean, it's not untrue. I mean, in some ways, especially back in the 70s. So they were very, so the idea of learning about photography, which then I stepped back and realized, so were a lot of people, right? It's one of these things where you realize you think you're coming up with this new paradigm however whether it's at work, in your writing, in your music, and you realize, oops, I'm actually in conversation with other people, even though I don't even realize it until I articulate what I'm doing, right? We were at the early class in terms of women, and all of these men were unfailingly supportive. I don't think that was a uniform experience for women at Wesleyan, but I might have just gotten lucky, I think. But they were really, and both John and Clark stayed in touch, tried to help me out in terms of when I decided to go to graduate school. They were very, and again, you realize this afterwards, that this isn't what everybody does, right? Not every, a lot of people, you graduate, goodbye. So it's a very, the faculty at Wesleyan, and the students, the faculty, I think.
Yeah, and I think the faculty was very progressive. I mean, I hear that from a lot of when we've had these conversations with others in our class, and I had the same experiences that I was in psychology, so I didn't do a lot of. I mean, I didn't take an art class.
Right.
I took literature classes. I took philosophy classes. I took religion classes. I took all the things that were sort of in that cluster around psychology.
Yeah.
And they were all very supportive. Mostly men. Yes, because we're in the early 70s, but very, very supportive of students and thinking. Of clear analytical thinking about things and thinking outside of the box about things. These guys kind of inspired you to go into what you do now.
Yes.
Or what you've been doing for the last
long
40 some years.
40 some years, right? Yeah.
Which is what? Let's talk about it.
Sure. So photo drew me in to study art history. So I did a graduate degree at the University of New Mexico, which had one of the first programs of its kind to study photography, the history of photography. And I had never lived in the Southwest before, and I loved it. I think if I hadn't been somebody who had what I consider a field that required a library or like New Mexico, especially when I moved there, this was back in the
Back
70s.
then. Yeah.
There used to be a grocery store, kind of grocery store, bookstore, cafe called the Lobo Cafe or some such thing on Central Avenue. And by 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, the copies of the Sunday New York Times, which had been flown from where they were printed, would arrive in Albuquerque. And there would be a line of expats from the East Coast who would pick up their copy of the New York Times Sunday edition at 4 o'clock. And again, I hope this memory has some relationship to it, like it wasn't 2 o'clock or 11, but I'm pretty sure it was late, like I think Albuquerque must have been kind of low on, the delivery, compared to Chicago or Los Angeles but it was that far away. And now that seems like, again, if you were to tell this to some 18-year-old, they would, but
Yeah, how do you just do it online? You don't
right, the idea. And again, it was kind of
waiting for
funny
the paper copy to be flown in from
to be
LA or wherever
right.
wherever they
And
printed
also,
it.
yeah, and how expensive, but it was this funny kind of little community of people who would wait there, who would come, and so it was far away. And I think if one of my classmates, in fact, named Chris Wilson, came down thinking he was going to major in photo history, and then his wife was getting her MD at the medical school, and she was planning on working with the indigenous communities around Albuquerque to be a doctor, a public health doctor. And he basically decided that he didn't think that he could really study photo history. And he became an expert in the regional architecture, right? So I think that was so the thing about New Mexico for me was, because I went on to Chicago to get my PhD, because it was such a wonderful place, but you really, rather than make it be a kind of second tier Cleveland or something, like in trying to get interlibrary loans or things like that, the better thing to do, and there was a lot of kind of work to do, would be to do something that had to do with the region, so the architecture of the region, the indigenous art of the region, the so New Mexico was this, but the thing about New Mexico for me was also that it had a program that brought in a lot of, intriguingly enough, very political people from South America, often people who were exiled, from this man from Paraguay. There was another, to your point about, we were talking about Mexico before we started this interview, my friend Luis Gomez, who, his father had fought in the Spanish Revolution. His mother had hidden him after Franco takes over. And so Luis gets a Fulbright to study how New Mexico he considered it a colony of the United States. He was, that was his analysis, that persisted, So anyway, so it was a fascinating, and I must say, Wesleyan, for all of its, what was wonderful about it, I mean, it didn't necessarily have, I didn't at least run into, maybe you did more in the social sciences. I mean, I didn't run into people who had professional achievement, but had been hard won in terms of, political turmoil. This is a long answer to you, but I think I'm thinking about Wesleyan in light of these things, because Wesleyan did give me the tools. It gave me the bone and sinew to be able to grapple with different kinds of intellectual conversations, and also gave me a breadth of knowledge. Like, I think of somebody like Henry Abelov's. I still think about his intellectual history class. I mean, it was amazing. Did you ever take a class with him, with Henry Abelov?
No.
It was this intellectual history, and it started, it included Samuel Johnson and Levi Strauss and Freud, and it was just, and he was just brilliant.
That would have been nice. That's something I
Yeah, so
miss.
just briefly, you asked where I've come from, what I've been doing. And I think, again, part of the reason I was going on at such length about New Mexico was that it was also really important. And I think it was an interesting counterpart to Wesleyan. And then I went on to Chicago, which was much more of a traditional kind of graduate school in that, it was, yes, I tend to think of
Wait,
it as a
where are
kind
you
of
from? Where are you from originally?
originally Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh, because that's,
Pittsburgh,
that's
that's
I
the
went,
accent.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's the
Uh-huh.
accent. And then
Okay.
my family moved to Long Island when I was 12. So I had I was a bridge and tunnel kid with New York City, right? And going down to, loving the museums. And, that was in the days, of course, when New York was, Ford to New York drop dead, right? And, but it was very still, I mean, it was still New York City was, excellent. Um, and we would go down there. Bob Kraft used to drive us down to go to Chinese restaurants, sometimes at night from Wesleyan. It was just Wesleyan was just close enough to New York City.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So you're from Pittsburgh. So you went to Wesleyan, you went to New Mexico and Chicago, upstate New York, and then you ended up at the University of Massachusetts,
Yes, yes. Mass
right?
College of Art, which is a
Hmm.
public. It's our usual name. Our usual routine is it's the only freestanding public college of art in the country. Which
So
what that
Massachusetts College of Art. I'm sorry.
yeah, it's called Massachusetts College of Art.
Mhm.
And the distinction is that many universities, state universities, have art schools, but we basically have an art school without a university kind of framework, I guess. So it's a freestanding school, and it's a very, it's a terrific school. Very special students. And, a colleague of mine, Ezra Shales, he graduated from Wesleyan, I think 90s, maybe early 2000s, but a design historian. And, we were talking about Wesleyan. I told him a little bit about what this was pending this interview. And we're just both explaining how, I mean, he was a different generation really for me. He's probably like 15 years younger, but a lot of the same things. He was a classics major. He went on to
Okay.
get an MFA in painting, and then a PhD in art in history of decorative arts from Bard. So very interesting,
Hmm.
trajectory. And we were just talking about how, one of the things you got from Wesleyan that is so important for college teaching now is a really solid sense that what you do, that scholarship and, for want of a better word, your accountability to the present. Right?
So yes, and so that's kind of how I took my Wesleyan education,
Right.
understanding Paulo Freire from
Yes.
Lisa Hoberman's class,
Uh-huh.
and social conformity from Benjamin Brzezinski's class. You
Mm-hmm.
know, those things I've carried my entire life
Right.
with me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, would you say you had an unrelentingly hard time? I mean, your rise coincides with Reagan, with all of these anti-government. I mean, all the things we now take kind of for granted, right? That you should treat poor people poorly, right? That's and you've been. I mean, has it
It's
been hard? I mean, has it been hard?
well, when you're inside of actually doing government, and I started pretty much at the bottom of my profession in government. I started off as a basic disability examiner, and before that, I was working in a mental hospital as a on ward therapist, group therapist.
Right.
So I was doing groups of people who had committed crimes and were under evaluation for whether they could stand trial or not, or had been sent away because they were guilty but mentally ill. Then I went from there to administering a government or working in a government program, and then administering a government program, and then writing policy for a government program that was about for people who are disabled,
Hmm.
who had mental or physical disabilities.
Right.
And yes, you have to fight against the tide of folks who are saying these people don't necessarily deserve tax dollars.
Right.
And then there's the advocates of saying, take my people first,
Right.
in front of these other people who are less deserving. Our people are more deserving. And
Right.
there are people who run from the program basically saying that I don't want to deal with it, even though they deserve it.
Mm-hmm.
They should have it because it's their only way that they're going to be able to eat and have a shelter over their head. But they run from it because of the stigma.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are all parts of, and so to bring it back together again, my Wesleyan education has always helped me stay positive about that because
Oh,
of the
interesting.
understanding of of how people work in systems, which in the 70s during my Wesleyan education, that's what the social science teachers were all talking about.
So did you ever work with other Wesleyan people?
Um, I did not work with other Wesleyan people. I'll tell you an interesting story though. Just recently, this past year, I worked with a Wesleyan person on the issue of disability. Uh,
Interesting.
Washington Post reporter, Lisa Rain, and she is a Wesleyan grad and went into journalism, and she covers issues of disability and other programs and covers government. And I was sitting in a train station in Quebec City
Hmm.
from a trip back there, and I'm looking at my phone because I read the Washington Post, and I see this story about the disability program. It's a story about the reason why I went to Baltimore to
Wow.
actually work in the disability program was to deal with the issue of the age and inapplicability of jobs that are quoted for the types of jobs that people can do, because part of the disability program has to be with you have limitations, but your limitations may or may not give you the ability to go back to your past job or maybe even other jobs that are available in the national economy. But the list of jobs hasn't really been updated effectively since the 1970s. So think about it.
So,
As people in the operations of the disability program across the country, they're forced to quote these jobs that really don't exist anymore.
it's
And
crazy.
so in 2010, I retired from my state job and I took a job in Baltimore to work on this particular project. And here she was, Lisa, writing about it and how it's still not pulled itself together yet.
Wow.
And I left in 2016, having worked with NIH on the project, with people uh, at Boston University, a rehab department on it, and a number of other people around the country on this. And we were getting it to the point where we could see where it was going to cost a lot of money to do, and we needed the Department of Labor working with us and a whole bunch of other agencies, the Census Bureau,
Mm-hmm.
boots on the ground, that sort of thing. Well, they haven't pulled it together yet. But her interest I was impressed by the fact that she understood what she was not just a reporter asking these dumb questions. She really knew what she was talking about. And I said, and then I looked her up and I said, oh, she went to Wesleyan, you know,
Yeah.
and so I said, yeah, the mind, the inquisitive mind, and to the willingness to try to understand at a deeper level
Mm-hmm.
topics that are important. I think we were taught that at
I
Wesleyan,
yeah, I would agree.
and that we could explore broader than just the lane that you're supposed to be in. And I know you got your doctorate degree, and doctorate degree is about establishing your lane,
Your lane, definitely.
and this is your area of expertise, and this is what you were going to be known for. But Wesleyan starts you off by saying, but look at all the different lanes that you could go in. And that's a great start.
But I think in a way the Wesleyan experience made a big difference. And I guess, I say Ezra, he only came in about 12, 15 years ago. But so, and just in terms of, again, trying to inspire the students with a sense of curiosity and a sense of, I think inquisitiveness is a better word than curiosity. I think inquisitive is a more active word, because what was always poignant for me too is that a lot of students at Mass Art, were, quote, bad at academics, right? They often had dyslexia, they had processing issues, they had been told, ever since they were in grade school that they were stupid, right? So they didn't necessarily, like when they came to our liberal arts or history of art classes, it was like, literally like castor oil, right? So part of my goal, and I think what I got from Wesleyan as well, was to tell, to basically show the students, that they could do this stuff, not just in the sense that they could pass these, tests, but that this was their heritage, this was their right, this was their, that they were thinking, they were already thinking, like, that's where Wesleyan actually, because it wasn't one of, I may have this nostalgia, kind of completely misrepresenting this, but again, people worked hard at Wesleyan, but I don't think they were necessarily, I don't know, I just didn't feel like knowledge wasn't instrumental there. That's my only, it's not a really good way of putting it, but it just felt like we had this highly privileged place, right, in terms of the facilities and the resources, to at least exercise those muscles, right? Because it's one thing if you go to a place, whether it's a government, where knowledge is so instrumentalized, you can kind of go outside of that, but the predominant structure is there, right? So Wesleyan, I think, for me at least, gave me an opportunity to build up that, those muscles about knowledge that didn't have to be instrumentalized. And I don't want to get jargony here, but anyway, so make a long story short, Mass Art was in an interesting, I regarded my training at Wesleyan to be absolutely crucial to my ability to be a good faculty member and colleague at Mass Art. And then to get back to your point about what I'm doing now, for the last almost 12, 15 years now, I've been working on sustainability in the environment, in the arts, and teaching
So what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah.
It means setting up teaching a class called The Climate Crisis in Contemporary Art. It means learning about the environmental humanities. It means trying to figure out policies for the college that have to do with energy use, resource use, recycling. And the people who were my colleagues in this area, they were some of the best people at the school, because they were, again, people who understood that their work, whether it was film or social practice or fibers, had to have some kind of connection with contemporary life, right? They weren't just going to be people who, so they were very, they were out there. And then there's just a lot of other people internationally thinking about these issues, right? Right. Even though the subject is so scary, right? And, I would often, less so now, like when we first started, I would teach this class, and then the class would end and I would start reading the newspaper again. And there was like nothing about the environmental crisis. Like I said, and it seems like the past 4 years, especially also linked with the pandemic, that's changed.
It's changed a lot now.
Yeah. But it wasn't that long ago. People have been talking about this stuff, since '89, at least. So, and in terms of what I'm going to do next, I'm really, one of the things that was very good about being
because you're emeritus right now, is that right?
Right.
That you've reached that stage in your career where you are now we started off talking about we're the elders. So now you're
The
the
elders.
elder. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what I've learned,
So what do elders do now?
yeah, well, the thing about that is, at least in mass art, I mean, I'm not talking like some, major research university like Harvard or, BU or something, but there's something called, I don't know if you have this expression in your field called a step down. You step down from your job rather than just, putting your stuff down and walking out the door. And so I've been
Yeah.
stepping down, yeah, and teaching. But I think and again, I don't know, this is relevant to the project you're setting. I mean, but I'm just finding that I don't really have much to do with the school anymore. And I'm finding that if you're not in the mix, your ability to intervene is very limited, right? So because you don't really have the breadth of, history. You just can't walk into a meeting that people have been doing for 6 months and think you have something to say, right? I mean,
Well, you're no longer
that's going
part
to be
of the institutional happenings of the school on a
right.
day-to-day basis. So it's sort of like in my field, you talk about the phases of people's careers and how they are, working to get to a certain point and they're building their own reputation. And then they become part of the institution. And then after that, it becomes sort of amorphous and people don't necessarily find their way. But
Right.
at that point, you're self-actual. I mean, Carl Jung would say, at that point you become self-actualizing. And
Okay.
then it's not that you're a part of something, but something's become part of you.
Hmm.
And and you're in a position to be the mentor or the elder or the and I've made these references, about that because that's kind of the phase of life that our cohort, kind of have seen ourselves falling into, possibly, or the checking out stage where you go like, I'm going to do this for me now. It's my
Right.
time. I'm no
Right.
longer institutional.
In some ways, teaching, it's writing on water, right? You just never at the end of the semester, you're kind of depleted and you don't really know what kind of impact you've had. I mean, you can grade people, right? But you don't really know
Mm-hmm.
what you've done, right? But you can also hope that you've done a lot, right? That, so you have the things that you set out into the world in these class, you're hoping that they will be picked up and expanded upon in ways that I can't even imagine, right? So I felt,
Mm-hmm.
as long as I'm teaching, that I was in a system of creation about the environmental crisis, right? The students, they're going to make different kind of fashion. They're going to make different kinds of pottery. They're going to make different kinds of, I mean, there's even a whole literature now about the energy use of digital media, right? So, of the idea of slow media, right? Of deliberately downsizing making films, for example, that are deliberately not using a lot of tech,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
right.
Okay.
So as long as I was doing that, I felt like I was contributing to the future. Now it's like, geez, the environmental. I mean, so I have to figure out what to do. Bill McKibben. Honestly, I don't know what to do because, I mean, there are organizations. There's Bill McKibben's. I think it's called, I don't know. And he's
Third
deliberately
act.
he's
Yes.
deliberately inviting people who are our age, the
Yes.
elders, to do
Yes.
this.
I know
Yes.
who you're talking
Yeah.
about now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So I could do that. I mean, but I don't know. So I'm trying to figure. I
And I've
mean,
thought about that. I'm a member of the Democratic Party senior caucus
oh my gosh.
of in Michigan. And we're talking the same thing. What can we activate seniors to do to mentor younger people in the Democratic Party to not just protect our issues, Social Security and Medicare and things like
Right.
that, but what can we also do that connect us with the the younger folks in the party of the various generations, and Young and Kohlberg and all those thinkers who tried to come up with, and more recently um, Robert Keegan in Boston. He's at
Okay.
MIT, I think, or Harvard, or may have been at both. He's been thinking about how do we get people to reach these levels of adult development that we do make decisions to use what we have, because we do. I mean, we're not dying at 50 anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're dying at 90 now, and there's a whole lot left in us to do things
Right.
that, and we could do it for ourselves, or we could do it for our family, or we could do it for an institution that we love, or we can do all those things. So, you know,
Or,
like this thing that we're doing,
exactly.
this is for Wesleyan.
Right. And it's, I mean, it's your, yeah.
And it's for our cohort at Wesleyan, but it's
Mhm.
also documentation for history in general, for anybody, you know, like you said, that someone's rummaging through and it gets like, what happened with, oh, look at this. There's a bunch of video recordings of people talking to each
On
other
Zoom.
on Zoom,
From
who all were in the same cohort at this
right,
university.
right. And it was this man who was living in Canada, you know, in the northern regions of Canada. You know, like who knows what kind of geographical definitions we're going to have in 50 years, right? You know, whether Canada will all be North America or something, or, you know, as the climate crisis, you know, makes
Oh yeah, and people all
you know,
move up this
the
way.
autonomous region of, you know, whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, again, we could also think about this as in terms of ramping up for the 50th, you know, which again, I can't fathom, right, that we're going to be 50 years, but that's coming up very fast. I mean, 3 years is, you know, just about 3 years.
Yeah.
But I think, and as you say too, I mean, again, you know, my mother died. My mother died of COVID, and but she was
Oh, I'm sorry.
93. Oh, thanks. And when my father died when he was only 63. So it's a very, you know, it's very raggedy kind of, you know, I don't have very, you know, but it's fascinating to think of, you know, what you could do, right? You know, because you were talking, I mean, what you just said was very much based in reality, right? You know, people live longer, right? And so I think that, so figuring out just what that, you know, the third act is, or, you know, what you can touch, again, to go back to your metaphor, is interesting. Or even just, you know, as one friend of mine basically is learning the sax,
Mm.
you know.
Well, and then I went back to music, which I never spent any time, and now I'm producing, and I solo.
Mhm.
I have no training. I call my virtual group the ignorant savants,
I've seen that. Yeah,
because
I've seen the word.
we don't know anything.
Mhm.
Okay, and so that's me not knowing anything, and then that's a very American. It's a very American aesthetic to
Mhm.
just get out there and do stuff without knowing what the hell you're doing.
Yeah, it's
And so that's my personal thing that I do in my third act. But then I do other things. I don't make that the only thing I do in my third act. And sustainability is a big one. And I applaud you in the work that you've done on that in the past, and I hopefully you'll go into the future with that, because it's something that we all should be thinking about. I have a podcast that I'm working on in my head, and it's called Healthy, and it's not about health. It's not about, you know, healthy eating and your health and medications and medicine. It's about, you pick a subject, grab a subject out of the blue, and let's talk about what's healthy and what's unhealthy, and what are the ways to do it. So, and that's sustainability is a central issue of that, you know.
that's, I mean, so healthy is less value laden than good, or right, or truth, or, I mean, like, healthy is something that you hope people have some kind of movement, like trophism towards, right? Health is a state that we all want, right? You know.
And that we can somehow define,
Yeah.
because we can see benefits and problems that come from doing it or not doing it. Like,
Right.
you know, how do you healthily walk into a crowd of people? Do you walk in with elbows out? Or you know, what
Right.
defines dealing with a crowd of people in a healthy way?
Huh. Or like taking an airplane in a healthy way, or
Yeah,
riding a train in a healthy, or driving. I mean, yeah, and it isn't just
yeah,
about, as you say, the literal, you know, my blood pressure, my Apple
yeah,
Watch information.
yeah. Right,
Yeah.
exactly. It's not that.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
you know, how many steps I take each
Yeah,
day, you know, because people want to talk about health that way all the time.
right. No, that's a very creative, that's a very Wesleyan thing, that seems to me.
And I do hope to be able to chat more with you and
Sure. Look forward to
and
that.
and 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 see you in a better place than just on a screen too.
Would be nice.
But I really do appreciate you being part of this, and hopefully in our planning, you might be doing some of these with other
And
people.
I will be in touch.
Okay, thanks again, Joanne.
Okay,
See you
great.
soon.
Okay, thanks.
All right,
Take care. See you,
bye.
Byron. Have a good weekend. Bye.
You too. Bye.